Thanks very much, Hunter, for the really nice introduction. And thanks to Brandon Yuxie for having me here. It's my great honor and pleasure to be here presenting at the OPI seminar series. I remember attending this series regularly 7 years ago when I was a postdoc. So it's great to be back as a speaker. So today I'm going to talk about a relatively new project with two students, actually at Harvard and I here at Princeton, about disparity analysis. So first of all, let me briefly talk about the history of what we call disparity analysis. We all know that the social and economic inequalities are a perennial topic of the social science research. And to analyze patterns and trends of different forms of inequality, quantitative research has typically relied on statistical models, especially parametric models, that link the conditional mean or the conditional variance of some outcome of interest, like income, wealth.
Could you turn that off? That's protection.
I was told to not touch anything.
See around, see. Okay, so continue. Just at the end.
You know where the mouse is?
That's the window. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks. Yeah, so to study different kinds of inequality, quantitative research has typically relied on statistical models, especially parametric models that link the conditional mean or variance of the outcome of interest, like income and wealth, to a range of explanatory factors, such as gender, race, class background, educational attainment, neighborhood conditions, etc. And the prime example of this approach is what we call the Kitagawa-blind Upaka method, where the goal is to decompose differences in the mean outcomes of two groups into two components. One component explained by different explanatory factors and an unexplained or residual component. And for a long time, this decomposition was called, and is still by many called the Blinder-Ohaka method, as it was independently developed by Blinder and Ohaka, two male economists in the 1970s. But in recent years, has been recognized that essentially the same decomposition was proposed 18 years earlier by sociologist Evelyn Kitagawa, a demographer in Chicago, who also served as the president of PAA. So increasingly, the method has been more fittingly called the Kitagawa-blind Ohaka method, or KBO method. So the KBO method is often used to study disparities across gender, race, class, what we call categorical inequalities, like to answer questions such as, to what extent can the gender wage gap be explained by gender differences in education and work experience? To what extent can black-white income gap be explained by black-white differences in class origin? And the second question is actually an old question posed by Otis Duncan 60 years ago. We'll come back to that paper in a couple of minutes. So the canonical KBO method decomposes the gap in mean outcomes based on linear models, although extensions of the KBO method have been proposed, which include decomposition based on nonlinear outcome models, decomposition based on models for group membership rather than for the outcome, and decomposition of differences in distributional characteristics other than the mean, such as quantile and the variance. And the KBO method is very useful for quantifying the contributions of different factors to a disparity of interest. But it does so in a demographic, accounting, or descriptive sense. For example, we could use it to evaluate the extent to which the black-white gap in college completion rates can be statistically explained by their differences in college quality, right? But such a decomposition makes no causal claim about either the effect of race or the effect of college quality. So there are 2 points here. First, we all know it's kind of philosophically tricky to talk about the causal effect of gender, race, or class background or other seemingly immutable characteristics. And practitioners of decomposition method are usually aware of that. But the more subtle and the less appreciated point is that the implementation of decomposition methods also doesn't explicitly address the causal effect of the so-called explanatory variables, because it doesn't really try to adjust for potential confounding of its effect on the outcome, right? So because it doesn't address potential confounding of relationship between explanatory variables and the outcome, it is not really well suited for policy for guiding policy. So now we might face a dilemma. On the one hand, we are conducting a decomposition that is purely descriptive. We might want to be complacent with purely descriptive interpretations of our results. But as social scientists, we are often asked by, writing papers for journals. We are often asked by reviewers or editors about the policy implications of our findings, right? So we could, abstain from making any policy recommendations, or we could make perhaps bold but maybe irresponsible policy suggestions. Right? So the key issue here is we are not really targeting the policy relevant estimate in such analysis, right? From a policy standpoint, we would be interested in different kinds of questions, in questions like what would be the black-white gap in completion rates if college quality was equalized between black-white college goers, or if college quality was somehow equalized conditional on some metric of merit, like high school GPA, right? But such questions are not really targeted by the KBO decomposition. So to address policy relevant questions, there is an emerging alternative approach in both sociology and epidemiology that tries to incorporate the language and the logic of causal inference into the study of disparities. And one early attempt was made by Jackson and Vanderweel, who considered, they wrote basically a methods paper in epidemiology in which they considered racial disparities in wages and other outcomes under hypothetical interventions that equalize childhood SES, equalize test scores as a proxy for educational attainment, or both. So they made some insightful discussions about the underlying estimate for different hypothetical interventions. And in one of my own studies, I considered levels of intergenerational income mobility under a hypothetical, somewhat idealized intervention that sets everyone's educational level to bachelor's degree to see if bachelor's degree attainment can really reduce intergenerational persistence of economic status. And partly inspired by these studies, Ian Lundberg, alumnus from sociology department here at Princeton, advances Jackson and Vanderweel's discussion through the concept of gap closing estimate, where he also introduced a range of regression imputation, weighting, and doubly robust estimators for this estimate. And more recently, with a student at Oxford, we wrote a paper using an extension of Lundberg's weighting estimators to time varying treatment and estimated black-white earnings gaps under a series of stylized interventions to both college attendance and the college completion. So basically treated attendance and completion sequentially and see how different kinds of race-conscious and race-blind interventions can help reduce the racial earnings gap. So what now? What do we try to achieve in this paper? So the primary goal of this paper is to review and explicate the two distinct approaches to studying group disparities, which we term the descriptive approach and the prescriptive approach. So for the descriptive approach, we highlight a generalized KBO decomposition or a generalized Duncan decomposition. You will see why we might want to call it a generalized Duncan decomposition in a couple of minutes, which consider multiple sets of covariates or explanatory variables sequentially rather than simultaneously. And for the prescriptive approach, we introduce new interventional estimates that are more akin to real-world policies than those considered in earlier work. And for all estimates, we present model-free definitions, non-parametric identification results, and a range of parametric and non-parametric estimates. And finally, we illustrate these two approaches by analyzing the black-white gap in college completion rates in the US. So here are a few more words about our running example. We know that in the US, Black college goers are much less likely to complete a bachelor's degree than their white peers. A recent study shows that among those who studied a 4-year college in 2010, 6-year graduation rate was about 64% among whites, but only about 40% among Blacks. And the higher education literature has identified a couple of contributing factors to the racial gap in college completion, including racial disparities in economic background, racial disparities in academic preparation, racial disparities in college quality, and also psychological consequences of negative stereotypes that African American students tend to face in academic life. So having this example in mind, let's first review the canonical KBO decomposition. Specifically, let's consider how family income as a explanatory variable contributes to the black-white in college completion rate. So here we just use Y for college completion, use R for race, and use X for family income. The goal, as we noted earlier, is to decompose the overall gap, which we denote by delta, into two components. A component explained by racial differences in family income, and the unexplained or residual component. So how does it work? We proceed in a couple of simple steps. We first compute in race-specific completion rates, basically the average outcome for Black and for white students, which we denote by YB bar, YW bar. Then we fit a linear model of college completion on family income only among Black students, right? Then we see how the model would predict if we substituted white students' family income for Black students, right? So the average predicted value for Black students gives us a, quote unquote, counterfactual outcome for Black students if they had the same family income distribution as white students. So the overall gap can now be decomposed as in equation 1, where you can see the explained component is just difference between the average predicted outcome for Black students and the average observed outcome for Black students. And the unexplained or residual gap will be the difference between the average observed outcome for white students and average predicted outcome for Black students. And we could also zoom in to see how the explained and unexplained components can be expressed in terms of regression coefficients and the average values of the predictor family income, right? And you can see we could conduct the decomposition in two alternative ways. We could just do the same protocol as we described earlier, right? We could also fit a model not among Black students, we fit a model among white students. Then we see how the model would predict if we substitute Black students' family income distribution for white students. That would give us a alternative decomposition as shown in equation 3, right? Where we use beta W to denote the regression coefficient for the regression only for white students. So these equations use different reference groups for the explained component, right? Which gives us different quote unquote counterfactual interpretations. For example, equation 2 can be the explained component in equation 2 could be interpreted as how much the Black completion rate will rise if the average family income of Black students rose to that of white students. Whereas the explained component in equation 3 would be more like how much the white completion rate would drop if the average family income of white students declined to that of Black students. Right? However, these interpretations, although they are quite intuitive, they can be very misleading unless the regression coefficient beta B and beta W really capture the causal effect of family income on college completion, which is often not the case. So in this particular example, we can see we are not attempting to address potential confounding of the relationship between family income and college completion, right? So it's generally much more prudent to use purely descriptive interpretations, like how much of the Black-white gap in completion rates can be statistically explained rather than causally explained by racial differences in family income. And we can also use a non-parametric formulation of the KBO method. First, we note that the population counterpart of the quantities YB bar, YW bar, and the average predicted value from the regression can be written non-parametrically outside the linear model as these quantities, right? The first two are basically the population counterparts of the sample means, right? And the last predicted value of outcome can be written as the conditional mean of the outcome among Y students given family income, then marginalized over the family income distribution among Y students. This quantity is a non-parametric quantity, not depending on a linear model. So the explained and unexplained components can be just expressed as the difference between theta and mu b, and the difference between mu w and the theta. And if the linear model for the conditional mean is correctly specified for Black students, then the canonical KBO decomposition will correctly target these quantities. However, these quantities, as we mentioned, are defined non-parametrically. They are not depending on any statistical model, which means they are still meaningful estimates, even if the linear model for that conditional mean is wrong, right? Or even if we specify alternative models, nonlinear models, logic models, probing models, or even flexible machine learning models, we can still define the quantities in exactly the same way, right? So this basically decouples the KBO decomposition from the linear models on which it is routinely based, right? So it eliminates the model dependence of our estimates. So, and this formulation, non-parametric formulation, also opens the way to a range of different estimation strategies. Right? First, we could try to estimate data using regression imputation. Right? So from the non-parametric formulation, we can see we only need to estimate this population means for each racial group and this data parameter. Right? So the mu parameters can be estimated directly using their sample analogs, using sample means. Right? So how to estimate the theta? First, we note theta can be rewritten as a iterated expectation, right? And this iterated expectation suggests that we can use a regression imputation estimate, where we fit the outcome model given race and family income. Then we obtain predicted values by setting everyone's race to be Black, right? And then we average those predicted values only among white students. That will give us a regression imputation estimator of this kind of counterfactual quantity. And if the outcome model is estimated using a linear model among Black students, then this regression imputation estimator will coincide with the average predicted value in a canonical linear KBO decomposition. But we can estimate the same thing even if we don't assume a linear model. And we can rewrite the estimate of theta in a different form. In equation 5, you can actually show that these two expressions are equivalent, right? But if you look at this equation, it suggests that we can use a weighting estimator, which was not used, proposed, about 20 years ago by Barsky et al. In Dasa paper. So this weighting estimator, you can see, involves fitting a kind of propensity score model for race, where race is the outcome, right? We use family income to predict race. To obtain predicted values of race being white and race being Black given family income. Right? And the weighting estimator will converge to the same quantity if the model is correctly specified. We can also combine regression imputation and weighting to form a doubly robust estimator of theta, which will be consistent if either the outcome model or the propensity score model for race, but not necessarily both, is correctly specified. We'll come back to the doubly robust estimator in a couple of minutes when we talk about the more generalized KBO method. So far, so good. Any clarification questions? Okay, so now we are done with the canonical KBO decomposition. You might ask, what if the covariates are multidimensional, right? So far we consider only family income. But in a lot of cases, the covariates are multidimensional, and we would like to assess the contribution of each covariate, right? In our example, the covariates could include not just family income, but also test scores, college quality, and other pre-college characteristics. Right? So in the regression imputation approach, if the outcome model is estimated using just a linear model with no interaction terms, then both the explained and unexplained components can be subdivided into covariate specific contributions. And this is often called a detailed decomposition in the KBO literature. However, such a detailed decomposition comes at a cost. It has a couple of limitations. First of all, it is not model-free. It depends on the linear specification of the outcome model. Actually, if we specify a more complicated outcome model where we include interaction terms between different covariates, then there isn't a clear way of separating out their respective contributions. So it's a model-dependent estimate. And it suffers from the notorious omitted group problem. Specifically, you can show that detailed components of the unexplained part can depend arbitrarily on the reference group we choose for the specific model specification, right? This is true for both categorical and continuous predictors. And a more subtle, but in my view, more important point here is the covariate specific contributions from the detailed decomposition can be really hard to interpret. This is especially true if the covariates are somewhat causally related or causally ordered. In our example, we could reasonably expect family income, like fathers or other indicators of family ES, to be causally prior to test scores, and test scores to be causally prior to the kind of college the students attend, right? So in such cases, we might want to tease out the contributions of these covariates in a sequential manner. We want to see how much contribute, how much of the gaps can family income differences contribute, right? Then how much of the remaining gap test scores contribute, right? Rather than treating these covariates entirely symmetrically as in the detailed decomposition. So the intuition of such a sequential approach, again, is not new. It actually dates back to the 1968 paper by Otis study Duncan. Okay. So the key question Duncan tried to address in this study was is the extent to which the persistence of racial economic inequality across generations can be attributed to inheritance of poverty, or in other words, class effects, or inheritance of race. So to answer this question, Duncan conducted a sequence of KBO decompositions for the black-white income gap, adding one covariate at a time. Of course, Duncan did not cite Blanda or Luhaka because paper came 5 years earlier than that. So what Duncan did, but essentially KBO decompositions, adding one covariate at a time. So here, Duncan first fit a model, including only class origin. Then he added number of siblings to it. Then he added respondent education, then respondent occupation. Then he teased out the net contribution of each covariate by comparing the explained components of every two consecutive models. For example, the difference in the explained component between the first model and the second model reflects the net contribution of racial differences in number of siblings after we account for racial differences in class origin. So to our knowledge, this is the first paper that used a sequential approach to analyzing group disparities. Although Duncan was very modest, he did not make any claim of methodological contribution, but I think this is a important insight. So we now give a nonparametric formulation of Duncan's approach, which we might call a generalized KBO or generalized Duncan decomposition. So what we do here is just let x1, x2, all the way to x, capital J. Hey, Brandon.
Sorry, can I just ask, when you say, so you use the word contribute a lot. So when you say contribute, what does that mean substantively? Like not mechanically, or is it just meant to be meant mechanically?
Right. Yeah, it's I use the word contribute in a mechanical sense, not really a substantive or causal sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
So like the sort of like the interpretive exercise for this comes later.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. 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 So From our perspective, the decomposition methods in general provide only descriptive interpretations of our data, just like a scatter plot, right? From a scatter plot, you can interpret the relationship between X and Y in different ways, and so is the decomposition method. It's a useful data summary device, and it could provide possible signs of causal relationships, but it's not designed to answer such questions. That's our perspective.
So the reason I guess I asked you at this point is, so when you're doing the characterization of the joint distribution, I think that obviously that can get, as you're sort of pointing out, right, that can get very complicated, like what that joint distribution means. But now you're sort of moving into like a sequence of conditional distributions.
Right.
And so, so we're not describing a single distribution anymore. We're describing something about like an ordered sequence.
Right.
And so I'm just trying to figure out how to think about that.
Yeah, you can think of it as partial association. Yeah, so here we let x1, x2, all the way to x capital J denote J order set of covariates that may contribute to the disparity of interest. So in our example, we use x1 for family SES, x2 for family structure, x3 for ability and behavior prior to college, x4 for contextual factors like neighborhood conditions, school characteristics, and x5 for a measure of college quality. So it might be argued that these variables are temporally or causally ordered, although this is not really required for descriptive interpretations, right? We conduct the decomposition sequentially, but that doesn't mean that these variables have to be causally ordered in the real world. So we also use this xj overline to denote the vector x1, x2, all the way to x little j combined, right? And by definition, x0 overline will be an empty set. So the estimates, the non-parametric estimates of Duncan's decomposition will become equation 7, where you can see again, it's an iterative expectation where we condition on x1, x2, all the way to xj combined, then we marginalize the conditional expectation over the distribution of those covariates among white students. So the black-white gap in college completion rates cannot be decomposed into J plus 1 components, J explained component, each corresponding to a different set of covariates, and one unexplained component. So here you can see the delta explained xj reflects the amount of disparity that can be statistically explained by racial differences in xj after racial differences in x1, x2, all the way to xj minus 1 are accounted for. So for example, in our example, the second explained component would reflect the amount of disparity that can be statistically explained by family structure after we account for racial differences in family SES. And the equation 8 suggests that we only need to estimate mu b, mu w, and all the theta j's. And again, mu b, mu w can be estimated by their sample analogs. And theta j, as you can imagine, can be estimated using both regression imputation and weighting, right? We can use a regression imputation estimator, right? And if the outcome model is estimated using a linear model among Black students, as in Duncan's analysis, the regression imputation estimator will coincide with Duncan's decomposition. But we can use alternative, more flexible models for the same estimate. And we can also use a weighting estimator that doesn't involve fitting outcome model, only a propensity score model. So basically, these estimators are the same as their counterparts in a canonical one covariate case, except that we do this iteratively for different sets of covariates. And we can also combine regression imputation and weighting to form a doubly robust estimator, as shown in equation 9. So this estimator will be doubly robust in that it is consistent if either the outcome model or the propensity score model for race is correctly specified. And an important point I want to make here is the doubly robust estimator has a couple intriguing and interesting properties. Is particularly amenable to the use of machine learning estimate of the outcome and propensity score model, in which case our target parameter estimate will still be root and consistent, asymptotically normal and semi-parametric efficient under relatively weak technical conditions. And it's often combined with cross-fitting, which involves the use of different subsamples to estimate the propensity score and outcome models, and to estimate the target parameter. And such a combination of doubly robust estimator and machine learning cross-fitting is just an instance of what Zhou et al. Call de-biased machine learning, which has been extremely popular in the causal inference community, but actually it's not restricted to causal inference. It can be used to answer purely descriptive questions as well. And another advantage of EML, apart from the robust and efficient estimates, is that it leads to theoretically justifiable analytical standard errors, which means we don't have to use resampling methods such as the bootstrap, which could save a bit of time. So I'm going to briefly illustrate the generalized KBO decomposition using a sample from NSY 97. So it's a sample of black and white respondents attended a 4-year college by age 25. And here we use R to denote race, we use Y to denote bachelor's completion by age 29. And we have 5 sets of covariates corresponding to demographic and socioeconomic background, family structure, ability and behavior, contextual factors, and the indicator of college selectivity. So here are the EML estimates of adjusted gaps. Actually, these are not adjusted gaps, adjusted mean completion rates. This is not correct label here. From this first row and the last row, we can see that observed completion rates for Black students was barely about 50%, right? Whereas the completion rate for white students close to 70%. There is kind of 18 percentage point gap. And from the next 3 rows, we can see after we adjust for family income, not just family income, family SES, family structure, and the student's ability and behavior. These covariates go a long way toward explaining the gap, right? And after we adjust for these covariates, contextual factors and the quality selectivity do very little to explain the remaining gap. And the remaining gap is close to 0, even before we adjust for these additional covariates. And this chart shows pretty much the opposite side of the same coin. You can see that the overall gap is largely driven by racial differences by family in family SES and in students' ability and behavior. Right? And the other covariates contribute only a small part of the disparity. Now let's move on to what we deem as a more policy relevant approach to disparity analysis. We have seen the limitation of the descriptive approach, right? And we know that unless the causal effects of the covariates are unconfounded, estimate of the generalized KBO decomposition will have no causal implications. This means the policy implications we tend to draw from such analysis could be misguided. To give you a more concrete sense of why, we have found that after accounting for background characteristics, racial differences in college selectivity does not contribute to the black-white gap in completion rate. You can see the contribution is very close to 0 after we account for other characteristics, right? But does this finding necessarily mean that the gap in completion rates cannot be reduced by interventions on college selectivity? Not necessarily, right? The fact that this covariate doesn't have additional contribution doesn't mean that we can't intervene, and doesn't mean that that kind of intervention would not help reduce the disparity. They're 2 separate questions. So to answer such questions, we need a more policy relevant approach to disparity analysis, which we simply call the prescriptive approach. So the main characteristics of the prescriptive approach is to specify one or more variables as manipulable treatments, right? To use the language called inference, and ask how much disparity would remain or would be changed under a hypothetical intervention to these treatments. So for now, let's for simplicity, we just consider the case of a binary point in time treatment A. In our example, A denotes attending a selected college. And we use A star and Y star to denote treatment and outcome variables under an intervention of interest. Then we can define interventional disparity as in equation 10, you can see it's just a difference in mean, but not difference in means of the observed outcome. It's difference in means of the interventional outcome, which is not observed, right? So because y star is not observed, we need to identify such quantities using some identification assumptions. We use x to denote a set of pre-treatment covariates. And so in our example, the pre-treatment covariates will just be the previous mentioned covariates x1, x2, x3, x4 combined, where we elevate the status of x5, call it quality, into the status of treatment. And we need a couple assumptions. The most important additional assumptions we make, in addition to conventional assumptions in causal inference, is system invariance, which states that the potential outcomes under treatment and under control will be the same before and after the intervention. So this assumption could be violated if we consider a large-scale intervention on treatment assignment. For example, if we consider expanding the pool of students who attend selected colleges, right? Then there could be a dilution of resources that each student receives, right? And that dilution of resources could lead to a decrease in the effect of treatment on the outcome, right? And the other assumptions are basically consistency or suitable unconfoundedness and positivity, standard assumptions we make in causal inference from observational studies, except that we now need consistency and unconfoundedness for both before intervention and after intervention. So under these assumptions, we can write the race-specific mean outcome under the intervention as either equation 11 or equation 12. They're complicated equations, but they point to two distinct estimation strategies. Here, P star is just denotes the probability distribution of the treatment variable under the intervention. So equation 11 suggests a regression imputation estimator. Here, what we do is we just fit an outcome model, given everything else, given race, covariates, treatment. Then we obtain predicted outcomes. For each unit, we obtain two predicted outcomes, one under treatment and one under control. Then we form a weighted average of these two predicted outcomes, where the weights correspond to the conditional probabilities of treatment under the intervention. So you can see the weighted average can be understood as a predicted outcome for unit I under the intervention. Then we basically average these predicted outcomes separately for blacks and for whites to obtain our target estimate. And we could also use equation 12 to implement a weighting estimator, where you can see the weight is basically the ratio of the conditional probability of receiving the observed treatment under the intervention to the conditional probability of receiving the observed treatment under the status quo. So it's actually just a generalization of IPTW in estimating average causal events. So, and we can also, as you can imagine, combine regression imputation weighting to form doubly robust estimators. And this doubly robust estimator is very similar to the one proposed by Ian Lundberg in his SMR paper. And there's a caveat about doubly robust estimation for interventional quantities like this. This is because we need to assume that interventional distribution is known a priori. After we make that assumption, the estimator is consistent if either the outcome model or the propensity model for treatment is correctly specified. But as an analyst, we rarely know a given intervention. We often consider a stylized intervention in our minds, right? Then we try to estimate that stylized intervention as a function of observed data. So what we do is to estimate, a stylized intervention, a conditional probability distribution of treatment under the intervention. Then we can treat them as fixed, treat those probability distributions as fixed. Right? This is a methodological convenience, but also I think it aligns with real-world policies, which are often formulated right before being evaluated. So we don't do two things at the same time. Now let me make the idea more concrete by showing you a couple of stylized interventions in our context. Right? So we consider some stylized interventions to equalize college selectivity by race. First, we could consider a stochastic intervention in which treatment, whether you attend a selected college, is a random draw from the marginal distribution of treatment among white students. So in other words, we flip a coin, right? So if, for example, if the proportion of white students attending selected colleges is about 25%, then we are basically flipping coin 2 times. Right? If we get 2 heads, we send that black student to a selected college. Otherwise, we send them to a non-selected college. So it's just a stochastic intervention. This stochastic intervention was first introduced in Jackson and Vanderbilt, also considered in Lundberg. Under this intervention, we can see the marginal distribution of treatment will be equalized between black and white students, but treatment actually becomes a lottery for black students, right? So this is why we might want to call this intervention a lottery type intervention, lottery type equalization. And you can see in a lottery type equalization, we break all pre-existing associations between pre-college characteristics and whether the students attend a selected college, which is quite unrealistic, right? And alternatively, we could try to equalize treatment. We could try to equalize treatment, marginally, without breaking the association between pre-treatment covariates and college selected college attendance. And this can be done through a functional form like equation 13, which seems more complicated than it is. So what it does essentially here is to proportionally increase the odds of treatment for all black students. So we have a parameter e to the delta here. If e to the delta is about 1.2, we basically increase the odds of attending a selected college by 20% for every black student. That's all. And here we could choose delta, as a positive constant, such that the prevalence of treatment among black students is the same as the prevalence of treatment among white students without the intervention to realize this marginal equalization. And the functional form 13 was introduced by Edward Kennedy in DASA paper in 2019, but Kennedy considered this intervention for a different purpose. He tried to address how population mean will change as a result of intervention like this. He did not use to study group disparities, but we could use it to realize marginal equalization without breaking the association between background characteristics and treatment. So under this intervention, marginal distribution treatment will be equalized between black and white students, but treatment still depends on background characteristics in exactly the same way as it did under the status quo. So it's much more akin to real-world affirmative action policies, right? So this is why we call it affirmative-action-type equalization. And in both of the above interventions, you can see the overall proportion of students attending selected colleges will increase as a result of our intervention because we don't do anything for white students, but we increase the odds of treatment for black students, right? And this might not be feasible due to budget constraints, right? Due to availability of seats in selected colleges. And even if it is feasible, it could lead to a dilution of resources per capita, right? Which, as we mentioned earlier, could lower the effect of attending a selected college on degree completion, which is essentially a violation of system invariance. So we could try to mitigate this potential risk by considering interventions without changing its prevalence, right? We could try to equalize treatment without changing its prevalence by considering the same type of intervention for both black and white students, but we use different parameters. We use a positive delta for black students to increase their odds of treatment, but we use a negative delta for whites, right? And to decrease their odds so that we realize marginal equalization without changing the prevalence. So this might be called,
Just a point of information. So, and I'm sorry, I forgot. So selective here, is it the most competitive variance category or is it's more broad than that?
Can you say it again? Sorry.
So selective, is it like, the top 50 colleges like the most competitive variance, or is it wider than that? Just
Yeah,
I
we
know
could,
that's not the point exactly here, but
right.
helpful as a schematic.
Yeah, that's definitely a point worth considering when we try to implement such type of interventions. But here, for illustrative purposes, I used a fairly broad definition of competitive colleges, which are defined as one of the most competitive or very competitive or just competitive, highly competitive, the first 3 tiers of selective colleges classified by variance profiles.
So just in thinking about this together, and certainly Doug is a better person to reflect on this. I don't think affirmative action is actually relevant to those bottom 2 categories as much as it is in the top, but let's talk about that in the kind of Q&A.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, so this is why we call this affirmative action type equalization without expansion. And all the above 3 interventions try to equalize treatment marginally or unconditionally, right? And we could also consider less ambitious interventions that try to equalize treatment conditional on some covariates, which we call conditional equalization. For example, if we use 0 to denote high school GPA, we could specify an intervention where the conditional probability of attending a selected college given high school GPA among Black students is the same as the conditional probability given high school GPA among white students without the intervention. Right? So this intervention achieves racial parity in treatment only conditional on high school GPA. It doesn't necessarily achieve parity marginally or unconditional. Right? And we could also consider conditional equalization without expansion by intervening on treatment assignment process for both Black and white students. For example, we could use a weighted average of conditional probabilities of given high school GPA for Black and white students for both Black and white students. In particular, we can choose W here such that the prevalence of treatment is the same for Black students and for white students, and also the same as its prevalence before the intervention. So this intervention achieves racial parity in selected college attendance conditional on high school GPA, but it keeps the prevalence of treatment unchanged. So these are some, stylized interventions that we were thinking about that could be, more or less realistic, and we could conduct a formal analysis of their effectiveness through the methodology we introduced. Right. So here, this is a chart showing our DML estimate of how much gap could be reduced under different types of interventions. Right. We can see most interventions we have considered do have a statistically significant effect in reducing the gap, right? And the largest reduction of the gap will occur under marginal equalization interventions like lottery type equalization, affirmative action type equalization. They produce very similar results and affirmative action type equalization without expansion. And conditional equalization is more modest, so they produce weaker effects in reducing the gap. And this is a chart showing the DML estimates of the mean completion rates under different types of intervention. We can see the reductions of the gap, are relatively small compared with overall gap, which is about 18 percentage points. The highest reductions occur for like 2.5 percentage points, like 15%, right? Not very much. But we can also see that reductions are mainly driven by increased completion rates among Black students than by decreased completion rate among white students. This is mechanically true for those interventions that don't intervene for white students. But even for apparently zero-sum interventions like affirmative action type equalization without expansion and conditional equalization without expansion, you can see we only see a tiny drop in completion rates among Black students, whereas we see a more substantial increase in completion rates among Black students. So to wrap up, we have discuss two approaches to disparity analysis. The descriptive approach is epitomized by the KBO decomposition and its variance, where all estimands are a function of observed data. That's why we call it descriptive. It's a useful tool for summarizing our data, and it might provide indications of possible causal processes to be explored in more detail. And the prescriptive approach interrogates how much of the gap can be changed or closed by various interventions, right? So it could lead to more rigorous analysis of policy implications, right? Make our policy discussion less ad hoc. And for both approaches, we can define and identify all estimands nonparametrically, right? And as argued convincingly by Brandon Ian and Rebecca Johnson, influential ASRPs, this practice improves greatly the clarity and transparency of research goals and assumptions. And also, as you can see, it opens the door to a range of different estimation strategies, including strategies that leverage modern machine learning methods without sacrificing consistency and other desirable statistical properties. So hopefully this last point is relevant not just for disparity analysis, but for all kinds of quantitative research going forward. Okay, I'll stop here. I don't have much time left. Looking forward to your questions.